many different ethnicities. And so he is left now, Ataturk, to try to form these various ethnicities into a nation state. Also behind, and very important to him, was his goal to build a modern state. For him, this meant a secular state looking west and avoiding entanglement with the Middle East, which he saw as dragging Turkey backwards. Now, I should mention that at this time, there was an alternative vision in Turkey, which looked towards reestablishing a state under the Sultanate. Remember, Ataturk abolishes the Sultanate, but there is, even at this time, an alternative vision. But it was Ataturk's vision which prevailed both in domestic and foreign policy. And issues such as treatment of minorities and Turkey's international interactions can be traced to this formative period of the Turkish Republic. A political scientist would see these first 3 points as essential for analyzing Turkey's foreign policy through a constructivist analysis. But an analysis of Turkish foreign policy would be remiss if it did not address the importance of security and economic issues for the Republic, what a political scientist would refer to as a realist perspective, and an idealist perspective, both. So, and lastly, as we move forward, we also have to consider the levels of analysis and the individual, the domestic and the international levels of analysis as we look at and analyze Turkish foreign policy. So with all of that in mind, our analytical frameworks in mind, how did we arrive? How did Turkey's role in the Middle East develop as it has today? How did we arrive here? And the quick answer is through the interaction of shifts in Turkey's domestic politics and individual leadership, changes in the regional and international system. And those are what we need to keep in mind. With Ataturk's vision of Turkey looking west, we see, in fact, he starts off, Turkey joins the Organization of Economic and Cooperation and Development in 1948, the Council of Europe in 1949, NATO in 1952. It becomes an associate member of the European Community in 1963. Turkey joins the EU accession process in 2005 and became an EU candidate in 1999. So with that understanding of again, I repeat, of Ataturk and looking west, let's see what happens as we move forward. Because even before the Justice and Development Party comes to power in November 2002, Turkey at times looked east rather than west. For example, after the West's negative reaction to Turkey's invasion of Cyprus, Turkey looked to the Middle East for support. Again, it sought Middle East support to ease credit for energy funding following the 1973 oil embargo. With the end of the Cold War, Turkey decided to join the international force to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait in 1990. At that time, Turkey permitted the use of the Incirlik Air Base and closed the oil pipeline from Iraq that passed through Turkey to Syria. This brought Turkey directly into Middle East politics and was such a change of policy for the Republic that the military's chief of staff resigned in protest. Because remember, at that time, from the beginning of the Republic until very recently, the military was seen as the guardian of Kemalism. And so here we have with Turkey supporting and the Iraqi, the U.S. coalition going into Kuwait and Iraq. This was a real change of policy and going against the principles of Ataturk, because Turkey was then becoming very integral into the Middle East. When I went to Turkey the summer following that invasion to push Saddam Hussein out of Iraq, when I went to the foreign ministry, the Turkish foreign ministry that summer, they told me that they estimated that that foray into the Middle East cost Turkey $40 billion. And he actually showed me and I have it in my files. I'm pointing to my filing cabinet. And it was enormous. And so there was a sting to that. But perhaps most problematic for Turkey as the outcome for that foray into the Middle East was the flow of Iraqi Kurdish refugees across the border into Turkey that resulted from that 1990 to 91 war. So at the request of Ankara, the US, France, and Britain created a no-fly zone for the Kurds so they could return to Iraq safely. This enabled the formation of the Kurdish regional government. And Turkey feared that this would become an autonomous Kurdish region or an independent state and would foster Kurdish irredentism and threaten Turkey's territorial integrity. And I want to show you in 2005, when I went actually to the KRG, my visa actually was issued from the KRG, not from Iraq. Perhaps the most problematic for Turkey was this fear sort of coming to, looks like it's coming to fruition. The Kurdish issue also brought Turkey to the brink of invading Syria in 1998. Syria and Turkey were at loggerheads over Turkey's GAP project. The GAP project consists of building 22 dams and 19 power plants, actually. But those dams were to be built, and many have been built, on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And this was a problem for, of course, for both Iraq and Syria. And what Syria did is they harbored Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, and his PKK troops, who were conducting an insurgency in Turkey beginning in 1984. So this was a very big issue for the water issue was a very big issue for Syria, and they were using this PKK issue to try to pressure Turkey. So this was, so what happened was that Turkey massed troops on the border with Syria in 1998, and Syria ejected Öcalan, leading to his capture in 1999. And this is a photo of him, of course, released by Turkey, because you see the Turkish flag behind him, not the PKK flag that he usually had been seen in front of. But this opened up an enormous opportunity, which was used by Turkey to change their relationship with Syria. They became much friendlier. There was improved trade and tourism and discussion on energy and transportation links. Though the two states had disagreements over the territory of Hatay, or Alexandrata, if you might, They allowed the territorial dispute over Hatay to sort of fade into the background. So the PKK also strained the Iranian-Turkish relationship, as did the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which was based on an Islamist ideology, which we know is diametrically opposed to the secular tenets of the Kemalist state. During the 1990s and into the early 2000s, Turkey accused Tehran of giving the PKK and radical Islamists shelter, as well as arms and training at the Iranian border. That tension ultimately led to a diplomatic rupture in 1997 after the Iranian ambassador called for Sharia law in Turkey. Despite this low-level conflict, nevertheless, the two states increased trade and energy imports, including the opening of a new gas pipeline in 2001, which, energy was very, very important for Turkey, which was industrializing, modernizing, needed that energy. During the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, the Turkish-Iranian relationship improved because both states worried about the possible formation of an independent Kurdish state. So they started to cooperate against the PKK and its Iranian offshoot, the Free Life Party of Kurdistan. From the perspective of Turkey, these foreign policies in the Middle East during this period echoed the fears of the Sevres syndrome and the challenge of unifying a multi-ethnic population going back to the founding of the state and Kemalism. And during this time, therefore, Turkey stayed on its Western-oriented path and its goal of joining the EU. In November of 2002, the Justice and Development Party came to power, built by younger members of the Welfare Party, the political party representing Turkey's Islamist National Outlook movement. The coalition that had led Turkey just prior to the AKP win.
Recording in progress.
Was seen as corrupt and inept. And therefore, this very new party, it had just formed months before, was able to win. It painted itself as a center-right party, a new party, an outsider party. And for the first years, they continued to build the relationship with the EU by adapting their human rights laws and greatly lessened the role of the Turkish military in policymaking. So this lessening of the military's role in policymaking not only democratized the government, it also, and pleased the EU and the West, it also protected the AKP position in government from this Kemalist elite, this military, which really wanted to weaken the Islamist-oriented party. So it was a dual domestic international impact with that move. The early AKP government also supported the US strategy of democratization in the Middle East as bringing peace to the region. In 2007, Professor Ahmet Davutoglu became Foreign Minister of Turkey and brought with him a more positive view of its role in the Middle East, announcing what he called a zero problems with neighbors foreign policy. It was based on historical depth and geographical positioning and rich legacy in international relations. And I'm quoting him when I say that. By this, Davutoglu meant for Turkey to become more active in the region based on its long history in the region and its geographical location, what Davutoglu referred to as strategic depth. That's the name of his famous book, in fact. We saw Turkey picking up its activity in the region, following the release of Öcalan and the talks with Syria, even before the AKP came to power, as I mentioned earlier. But when the AKP did come to power, it worked hard to change the historically difficult relations with Damascus over water, territorial disagreements, and the PKK. And they changed it. And they worked, and Davutoglu especially worked very hard on this, to a relationship of increased trade, visa-free travel, military cooperation, and friendship. The relationship went beyond normalization to a strategic partnership and even a family vacation together. They met for weekends. In July 2004, Bashar al-Assad made the first visit of a Syrian president to Turkey. All of this, and at the beginning, actually, of the AKP coming to power. In 2007, Davutoglu was named foreign, as I said, he was named foreign minister. By 2009, Turkey and Syria had joint meetings of their most important cabinet ministers. Turkish-Syrian trade increased from $1 billion to over $4 billion in 2 years. Assad referred to Turkey as Syria's best friend, and Erdogan called Syrians his brothers. In 2009, Saudi King Abdullah visited Turkey, the first by a Saudi king in 40 years. 2 years later, Turkey signed a memorandum of understanding with the GCC, making it the first strategic partner outside of the Gulf. Turkey formed a high-level cooperation council with Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon to enhance cooperation on common concerns, and which they said would be open to other brotherly countries. Davutoglu organized a high-level, I'm going quickly just to give you an idea of the enormity of the activity here. Davutoglu organized a high-level cooperation council with Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, and free trade agreements between Jordan and Syria, and another between Turkey and Egypt. Clearly under the influence of the AKP, and especially under the influence of Foreign Minister Davutoglu, Turkey was now looking east towards its Middle East neighbors while maintaining its relationships with the West as a source of influence and trade in ways that would, I have to say, in ways that were not always welcome in the West. And I won't go into that right now. Let's take a closer look at Davutoglu's vision for Turkey's foreign policy. First of all, Davutoglu refers to Turkey as a central country because of its geographical location. For him, countries can also be referred to as central because of their cultural and historical heritage. With that in mind, Davutoglu outlined 5 principles of Turkish foreign policy. 1, there should be a balance of security and democracy to allow the republic to establish an area of influence in its environs. 2, a zero problem with policy towards its neighbors. 3, developing relations with Turkey's neighboring regions and beyond. 4, adherence to multi-dimensional foreign policy aimed at complementarity rather than competition. And he included there the EU, NATO, its neighborhood, and the US. And lastly, rhythmic or sustained diplomacy, including the institutionalization of Turkey's foreign policy. And so he makes all these agreements institutionalizing that foreign policy. Some will recognize a soft power approach to foreign policy in that list of 5 principles. We see this in Turkish foreign policy, not only with Syria, but with Turkey and the KRG. As noted above, Turkey was concerned about the formation of the KRG and what it would mean for possible growth of the PKK and/or an independent Kurdish state. Because the PKK was using northern Iraq as a safe haven from which to attack. So when they were not able to crush the PKK in northern Iraq in any other way, and the US wasn't as helpful as Turkey had hoped, Turkey reached out directly to northern Iraq with Davutoglu, and ultimately Davutoglu visited the KRG in 2009. And Turkey opened a consulate in Erbil in 2010. So Turkey began to work with the KRG. Now, on the domestic side, this gave Turkey an opportunity to try to solve the Kurdish problem. And I'm using this term that was used by the Prime Minister Erdogan in 2005. It was new. A Turkish leader did not use that term Kurdish problem. And in fact, for many years, leading up to 2002, you couldn't use the word Kurd in Turkey. You referred to Kurds as mountain Turks. So to do this in 2005 was really something very new. What we saw in this early AKP period is the government trying to clarify its difference with Turkey's former party and policies. It did this by deftly weakening the military, which saw its role as the defender of the Kemalist secular state, thereby giving the AKP more room to change domestic and foreign policy. It also worked with liberals, which gave them intellectual capital, criticizing the earlier regime. And thirdly, it worked with the Gulen movement, also an Islamic-based organization, which helped to fill administrative positions, most especially in the police and judiciary. And it also reached out to Kurdish nationalists. This desecuritization strengthened the AKP position in the domestic and international theaters because it opened up opportunities for Turkish businesses in the region and increased Turkish access to badly needed energy resources. In the international arena, Turkey benefited also from the West because the West was painting it as a model for democracy in the region. Now, while some Sunni countries in the region saw it as a balance also to what they feared was an increasingly powerful Iran that was no longer balanced by Iraq. Because remember, Iraq was no longer, after that, the 1990 war, Iraq just didn't have the power to balance Iran any longer. Therefore, some Sunni states in the region saw Turkey as the balance against Iran and its Shiite allies in Iraq and Lebanon. Following this period, Turkey increased its more independent stance in the region from that of its Western allies, with some referring to Turkey's foreign policy as soft Eurasianism. We see this with Turkey's policy towards Israel and its support for Hamas, with its engagement with Iran, and deepening relations with Assad in Syria. And therefore, Turkey I want to point out that Turkey had in the 1990s a very, very close relationship with Israel, very close. So, and when the AKP came to power, they didn't change that policy for a bit. They didn't stay quite as close. There weren't so many deals, but there, as we're going to see, it was still a positive rather than a negative relationship. But this changes during this latter period. So they just quickly, Turkey's policies at the time, they support Hamas, they engage with Iran. This is all very different than what the West would have wanted. They deepen their relationship with Syria. And in fact, they work with Brazil against the UN sanctions that, the US led, to the UN sanctions to tighten, to even tighten the sanctions on Iran due to its nuclear program. And Davutoglu and Brazil worked very hard to avoid those sanctions. They didn't succeed. Erdogan also welcomed at this time Sudan's Omar al-Bashir for a meeting of the Organization of Islamic Countries, which was taking place then in Istanbul. And by having Bashir to Istanbul, Erdogan was defying an arrest warrant that was out on the Sudanese leader, which had been issued by the International Criminal Court. Erdogan explained that he did not see genocide on his visit to Darfur, and I quote here, "It is not possible for Muslims to commit genocide." Turkey's policies towards Israel have been extremely close, as I referred to before. And so what we are seeing here is some very serious changes. And I want to go one step closer as I go back to Israel one more time. What happened was Turkey and Erdogan and Davutoglu, during this time of building their soft power in the region and building their relationships with the region, they also they tried to be peace brokers. And Erdogan had brought Israel's prime minister to Turkey, and was meanwhile talking to Assad, and although not bringing them face to face, was trying to broker a deal, a peace deal between Israel and Syria. But what happened is, within days of going back to Israel, Israel invaded Gaza, and it incensed Erdogan. And he attacks President Shimon Peres, who was himself pretty much often seen as a peace broker. He actually, Erdogan attacks Shimon Peres at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos. And a year later, that relationship worsened because Israel attacked the lead boat of a flotilla owned by Turkey, bringing aid to Gaza. So that was just, the relationship was very, very damaged. But the big change in Turkey's foreign policy in the Middle East began with the Arab uprisings for Turkey. And this was an opening for Turkey to assert itself as a leader in the region in its attempt to aid in the transformations in the Arab world. And this meant it was no longer concentrating on its role as an honest broker in regional disputes. We saw this in Turkey's support for the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria, while Ankara supported some other Islamist groups as well. In Egypt, it was an early supporter of the pro-democracy forces calling for the overthrow of the Mubarak regime. And it was a strong supporter of the Muslim brother Mohammed Morsi when he took power. And Turkey strongly condemned the military overthrow of Morsi by Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Erdogan attacked the Sisi government and other states supporting him at his speech in the UN in 2014. In Syria, we see an even more pronounced change with the uprising. Turkey's policy towards the Assad regime was that of a complete turnaround. Ankara pushed Bashar al-Assad to include the opposition in government, and that would include the Muslim Brothers, who Hafez al-Assad had not only banned in Syria, but had wiped out in Hama in 1982. When Syria refused, Turkey not only withdrew its support from the regime, it allowed the opposition safe haven over the border. It supported some of its opposition forces, allowed foreign fighters who wanted to join the opposition to cross the border. Erdogan, no doubt, thought that Assad would fall, as did Mubarak, and with his support of the Muslim Brothers, Ankara would have more influence in Syria. I want to bring up one very insightful journalist at the time. He was perhaps the most respected journalist, Mehmet Ali Birand. Unfortunately, he has passed. At the time, he wrote that Syrian state television was accusing Turkey of arming Syrian Muslim brothers. He went on to point out that for the Syrian regime, the Muslim Brothers was seen as much of a threat to the state, the Syrian state, as Turkey sees the PKK threat. So this period brings together three important factors we listed at the beginning of this talk. The ideological influence, this time not of the secular Ataturk, but of the Islamist-leaning Erdogan and Davutoglu at the time. Two, the Arab uprisings were called by Davutoglu the end of the imperial designed Sykes-Picot order and the opportunity to restore the Ottoman peace with the Republic as the heir of the Ottoman Empire, playing the leading role in the process. And thirdly, so that's just the opposite of what Ataturk had been talking about. And third, the support of the domestically of the Gulen movement, which influenced the state institutions. But Turkey's relations began to stall soon after the accession process with the EU. So that was stalling. But starting from 2016, with almost all of the MENA countries, except Qatar, deteriorated, and Turkey began to use military tools in its foreign policy. Its major concerns were the PKK-affiliated Syrian Kurdish Democratic Party and its armed wings, the People's Protection Unit, the YPG, and its women's arm, the YPJ, that occupied sections of northern Syria, which they called Rojava. That border, Turkey feared would give safe haven for PKK fighters. I'm concerned about the time. How much time do we have left?
We have 5 minutes, Lenore.
5 minutes.
5 to 7 minutes, yeah.
Thank you. The Syrian Kurdish region aligned with the PKK, by the way, because of that affiliation, posed a greater threat to Turkey than does the KRG leadership, that cooperates with Ankara on economic and political issues. And therefore, the Turkish military began Operation Euphrates Shield to prevent the linking of the eastern and western sections of the area that were held by this Kurdish PYD. I want to say that there were a number of us who were thinking, and I know that there were people also in Turkey that were thinking, why, if Turkey could work with the KRG, why didn't they at least try harder to work across the border with the PYD, which really did not, really would have been worth the try, considering what we see going on now. The military intervention in Syria has also been interpreted by some as an assurance to the Turkish people that the military remains strong after the attempted coup in July 15 in 2016. It also helped to build the AKP's nationalist rhetoric as a campaign to convert Turkey's parliamentary system to a presidential system, a major goal of President Erdogan. In the international sphere, Turkey's perspective on the dangers of the Syrian civil war differed greatly from a number of states in the region, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, who were most concerned about the buildup of the Islamic State forces and Islamist groups in that area. The YPG forces were the US boots on the ground. You must have heard that many, many times. However, Russia controlled Syrian airspace and allowed Turkey's military intervention in order to continue to develop its relations with Turkey. For Turks, the US decision to arm and train the PYD and the YPG to fight the Islamic State was enormously problematic, as it is seen as strengthening Kurdish autonomy in northern Syria and endangering the security and territorial integrity of the Republic of Turkey. So with the consent of Russia, Turkey launched 2 more military operations in Syria and has been talking about another. Besides Turkey's concern with the PKK, it has also been concerned about the close to 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, who Ankara would like to return to Syria. In addition to the Syrian intervention during this period, Ankara took a much more oppositional role with Egypt and Israel. It also initiated a more active involvement in the Persian Gulf and a more assertive foreign policy in Libya. In the Gulf, Ankara came to the aid of Doha by extending its small military base in Qatar and helping to resist the embargo imposed on Qatar by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The AKP government also began to get involved diplomatically and militarily in Libya, even to the point of using Syrian mercenaries, as well as Turkish troops. And in return for that intervention, the GNA, the Government and National Accord at the time, announced a memorandum of understanding with Turkey for an exclusive economic zone that extended across the Mediterranean and included access to oil and gas resources under the continental shelf. Turkey's foreign policy alignments and troop deployments in Libya, Qatar, and Syria were linked to the AKP's ideological affinity with the Muslim Brothers and similar groups in each of those countries. Ankara also benefited from the economic bolstering Turkey received from Qatar and Libya. Qatar has improved Turkey's economy, I don't have to tell you this, with foreign direct investments and currency swaps. The Libyan Memorandum of Understanding offered Turkey the possibility to develop those energy resources in competition with Greece and the other members of the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which is Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, Italy, Jordan, and Palestine. Notice Turkey was not included there. Turkey's policies during this period also continued to alienate Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi, who viewed Turkey's support for the Muslim Brothers as challenges to their own regimes. So I have to say that this foreign policy change on Turkey can partially be explained by changes in the international and regional system, the increasing multipolarity and the decline of the West in the region were hallmarks of an emerging international system. This transformation of the international system has increased the room for maneuver and enhanced foreign policy flexibility for middle powers like Turkey. Yet the main impetus for the foreign policy change can be also found in domestic politics. And therefore, this Turkey's alliance with this very right-wing MHP, which they needed in order to win elections and to successfully change the constitution to a presidential system, which Erdogan really wanted. Beginning in 2001, another significant shift in Turkey's foreign policy began unfolding in the MENA region. This was characterized by Ankar's efforts to normalize relations with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel, following its conflictual relationships with all of these states. First, Turkey sought to normalize its relations with the UAE, which the AKP government and President Erdogan had accused of financing the failed coup attempt. And of course, this began with exchanges. The UAE announced a $10 billion fund to support investments on Turkey. And also there were 13 more agreements when Erdogan visited the UAE in 2022. Soon after that, the normalization of relations with the UAE, the AKP government signaled its interest in resetting its relations with Saudi, and they had absolutely hit rock bottom when the journalist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in Istanbul in the Saudi consulate. But when Turkey finally said, okay, we will not prosecute Saudis for that killing in Turkey, we'll let Saudi do it. There was an exchange of visits between the Saudi King Prince Salman and President Erdogan. And there was talk of a $5 billion currency swap or deposit that just recently happened following the earthquake. And Saudi has now put $5 billion into the central bank of Turkey. Equally unexpected was the about face with Turkey. They now have appointed ambassadors after 4 years. And of course, there's a benefit for Turkey of tourism there, and perhaps of Israel transporting natural gas through Turkey, though that's talked about so often and doesn't seem to happen. The most dramatic, of course, was the announcement of interest in improving relations with the Assad regime. And there have been two important ministerial meetings on that. This change clearly has domestic variables as well. One, the possible return of Syrian refugees to Turkey, and also the concern about that unending concern about an independent Kurdish entity in northern Syria. So this felt need to reach out to Assad and cooperation in that vein. And it's interesting, I'm going to just give you a one-liner here because it's going to echo back to the very beginning of this talk. The foreign minister, Çavuşoğlu, announced after a brief meeting with the Syrian foreign minister that and I'm quoting here, there must be a strong administration in Syria to prevent any division of the country. Okay, it may be argued that these normalization efforts in the MENA region do not indicate a wholesale change. And there are still national discourses and frequent use of military tools. Turkey's still involved in Libya. And there is still concern about so many of the issues that Turkey faces. And of course, as you all know, there are Turkish elections, both presidential and parliamentary, in 2023. And the Turkish economy is doing terribly. The inflation rate has averaged, in 2022, the average inflation rate was 73%. So he needs increased investments. He needs to really bolster the economy in order to get back AKP supporters who had begun to leave the party. And so he started the charm offensive that I mentioned after 10 years of a very different foreign policy. What I'm not going to have a chance really to discuss with you is what Turkey really could do, I think, to adjust their policies. Most importantly, for their foreign policy in the region, Turkey really needs to adjust its policies on the Kurdish issue, not only internally, which Erdogan started and then abruptly stopped, but also there are things he can do that I can't, to open up the possibility of a better situation with the Kurds. Some talk about constitutional changes, some talk about autonomy. I mention this because I know you all are interested in peacemaking yourself and addressing conflict. So I thought this would be an interesting problem for you all to try to solve, which I've been thinking about for many, many years. And another thing besides autonomy and constitutional changes, which could be very difficult and maybe take a very long time, but you could adjust autonomy. You also could enable the Kurdish political party to exist. Turkey's continually closed the Kurdish political parties. And they now have, since 2016, the leader of a very successful and open-minded Kurdish party. They've had Selahattin Demirtas in jail, since 2016, making it very hard. Some people call him the Turkish Kurdish Mandela. So I'll leave you with that peace, that message of peace, and I'm sorry if I took too long.
Thank you so much, Lenore. شكرا جزيلا لك لينور على هذه المحاضرة. أعتقد أن
Lenore for this talk. I think this comprehensive review of Turkish foreign policy and its role is very important for our students who are engaged in conflict resolution and for all those who are engaged in international relations and political sciences. We will start with the questions. There are questions from the participants and some questions I'll pose. We'll take 3 questions and give you a chance to respond, Lenore. How do you see the future of Turkey's foreign policy in the Arab region now that the Arab Spring is on the retreat, especially if we take into consideration the presence of the Kurds and the relations of Kurdish people in Syria and in Turkey, and how will the direction of Turkey's foreign policy be vis-a-vis the Assad regime, taking into account the concerns by Ankara towards the Kurds? And the second question is related to the relations with the Gulf region. How do you see Turkey would deal with the Gulf countries, especially in the view of normalization with the UAE and Saudi Arabia? A third question from the participant.
And attacking the Turkey vessel, which were loaded with aids to the Palestinians, but still diplomatic and embassies working in both countries. Similar to that, notice the Turkish and Saudi relations, which in 2018, 2019 was at the highest of its tension due to the Khashoggi incident, and now in turns to friendship and warm relations, similar to UAE and PKK support, and Turkey aware of that support. And now the relationship become excellent. So how you can explain the Turkish foreign policy regarding the Gulf states? And this is the question من Abdullah Sanadi. So Lenore, there is 3 questions. So تفضلي.
Thank you. Well, as you can tell from the end of my talk, you asked very key questions, and you're giving me a little more time. I think to address these issues, I think there's no question that Turkey, first of all, Turkey's economy at this point is terrible, and the disastrous and tragic earthquake, which has taken, I guess, over 54,000 lives in Turkey and Syria. It's devastating, and Turkey economically is not doing well. As you know, even though, what I didn't mention was that President Erdogan has a very different viewpoint of how to handle the economy than almost any other economist. And he refuses to up the interest rate, and therefore to help bring in resources to the country and economic resources. So with a high inflation rate and now an unemployment rate, which everyone believes is much higher than what the government is putting out. I don't remember the exact numbers, but he needed to do something because he knows he has elections coming up, and he wants, among other things, to be president in October 2023, which is the 100th anniversary of the formation of the Republic. So he needs to do something economically, and he knows that. And so he needed to do something economically, and reaching out to the UAE and Saudi made perfect good sense. And Erdogan is a businessman. Okay, he was an athlete and he was a businessman before he became a politician. Yeah. He understands. So that's one issue, and a very, very big motivating force. And the other one, as I mentioned with Syria, the refugees are politically a problem in Turkey. At first, Turkey was a model, and probably still is compared to some other countries in its treatment of refugees. On the other hand, there is a lot of resentment and a lot of anger towards the refugees and among the Turkish public. And so there is a real drive to try to enable the Syrian refugees to go back. Now, I think there's no go back over the border. Now, I think with the earthquake, that's going to make it even harder. It's a total and absolute tragedy, but I don't think there's any doubt that Erdogan is a pragmatist. He sees that Assad is in power. He's not the only one, right, reaching out to Assad. The earthquake enabled other countries to reach out in the Middle East, to reach out to Assad, use it as, if I may be so bold, as an excuse or a screen through which to, reach out and restart relationships. He's going to be the leader. How strong a leader? We don't know. Iran is very strong, a strong actor in Syria. Russia's a very strong actor in Syria, but Assad's there. So it makes sense for him, especially because he needs security on that border. I want to point out that, and I think this is where political science can be very, very helpful in looking at analyzing a region. When I was in Turkey, soon after this rift with Syria, I gave an interview in a newspaper, and I said that Turkey's very strong stand against Assad and allowing opposition forces over the border, and, to be over the border and to give so much support to the opposition was a very dangerous position for Turkey because of the Kurdish issue. And I said, do we really think, and it's a question, the question is into the future, is Assad going to really forget the enormous hand that Turkey has played in that war? Perhaps not. I call it in some of my writings the PKK card. Is he going to play it? In the back of his mind, Assad, in the back of Erdogan's mind, who's going to play that PKK? Well, Turkey's not going to play it. But the point is, it was, and why I say go back to political science, go back to systems analysis, go back and look at the power paradigm that was going on there. Look at the history. And that's why Turkey needs, and I've said this for so many years, to solve its PKK problem. It's Kurdish problem. It's not a PKK problem. It's a Kurdish problem. You can make a deal with Demirtas. He's ready to make a deal. I mean, we've seen this in South Africa. We've seen this in Ireland. He can make a deal, and I think that's very important. Have I answered most of those questions?
Yeah, but one more question, Lenore. سؤال إضافي كذلك نود أن نضيفه.
Another question we would like to add, please. It is linked to your description of Erdogan as a pragmatic personality. How do you see Erdogan between the pragmatic aspect of him and the ideological feature of his Islamic background? How does he employ all of this in his decisions and relations with others?
Thank you very much. A very important question as well.
شكرا جزيلا.
And that is that what he is deep in his heart an Islamist. By that I mean his belief in the role of government and religion is very much akin to a Muslim brother type of relationship. Mm-hmm. That is where his heart is, where his upbringing in a way is. But he is willing to do, but he needs to stay in power in order to see that that relationship continue to take hold in Turkey, both domestically and internationally. And he's a pragmatist. He knows he's not going to stay in power and be able to see his vision through unless he does that. It's interesting, if you see pictures of Erdogan sometimes, he's got Ataturk he's got the photo of Ataturk. Yeah. I almost put one of those on the slide, but you can see them very easily. So he's a pragmatist, as was, by the way, Ataturk in many ways. So Ataturk actually used religion, even though he wanted a secular state. He used religion. He used the idea of Muslim, of Turk, to pull that nation state together. He did it carefully, but he did use it. If you're not a Sunni Muslim, Turk, you are seen as an outsider to this day, even in Turkey. So what does that say about Ataturk? He too was a pragmatist, as we see with Erdogan. Also a strong vision, but pragmatism to get there.
شكرا لك لينور. سؤال أخير يبدو وسنختم به الجلسة.
Thank you very much. We have one last question. What do you expect after the elections? If Erdogan makes it once again, do you think that his foreign policy is going to change in your view?
I think if he wins again, he's going to be very domestically oriented for a while. And I don't see much of a change. And I say that because of the earthquake, and to build that economy, he still needs to build that economy. He still needs to build trade. You know, he had an enormous amount of support from some business groups who strongly supported him, and went out and built networks in Asia and in Africa, in the Gulf. I mean, and I think he will not take an aggressive path, at least not in the very short run. He has if he wins, he has a big domestic agenda, and that's to build up his state, his economic.
Thank you so much, Lenore. We appreciate your time. شكرا جزيلا لك, Professor Lenore Martin.
We would like to thank you very much, Professor, for this lecture. So I think that this seminar is very, very timely indeed, particularly that the elections are very, very close. So Turkey plays a very important role in the conflicts and the alliances taking place in the Middle East. And of course, Turkey is going to play a role when it comes to the reality of the Middle East in the coming years to come. So I'd like to thank you, Professor, for your participation, for the lecture that you have delivered. Would like to thank you for your time, particularly that this is an early time in Boston, and particularly that it is cold in Boston now. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Professor. And it was a pleasure having you amongst us. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.